We are thrilled to be able to welcome the one and only Celine Halioua from San Francisco today. She is the founder of Laura, a startup with a mission to develop the first drugs specifically designed to extend health span and lifespan. She was previously chief of staff to Laura Demming at the Longevity Fund. Today's session will be a discussion-style interview with our two guests, Rana and Tumiel. Jared hasn't managed to join yet, but he might join in a bit. So Jared is a multidisciplinary medical doctor from South Africa. He is also a fellow of the OnDeck Longevity program and host of the Bit of Attention Rationalist podcast exploring ideas in science, philosophy, AI, and medicine. Rahul is the author of Making Moonshots, a deep dive into the mindsets, philosophies, and strategies conducive to building moonshot companies, and was previously also venture associate at Lux Capital. So without further ado, I will hand off the session to you guys.
Hello from San Francisco. I have a surfboard to one side of me, and I don't know if you can see that, but the cityscape on the other. So walking stereotype right now.
That's awesome. It's awesome. I'm currently in my childhood bedroom in New Jersey because I'm with my parents for the Hindu New Year. Celine, how's it going on your end? How's everything been recently?
Living the dream.
That's awesome. It's awesome. So yeah, before we sort of get into like the discussion, I'd love to get your background and specifically one part of it. I noticed that you have sort of like a Bionanotech background, and I'm curious, how does that sort of influence your worldview? Why did you study that? And what was sort of the application to Loyal?
Yeah. So I guess a little bit of context. I was actually a super terrible student in high school. I was bottom 10 in my class. Like I remember I told some teacher in my high school that I wanted to go and study something complex and laughed in my face. And I got into college for art school initially. But then I switched to neuroscience, and really my like North Star with that, it was a biological area that was interesting that also nobody really understood. I basically wanted to be in a discipline where literally in the first class, Neuro 101, they're saying, we don't know, instead of, 4 years of catching you up to the existent knowledge, which is at the time what I felt like the other biological fields would be like. Of course, there's a lot of caveats now, and I understand biology, I recognize that all fields are like that, but that was kind of what 18-year-old Celine was thinking. And then, I basically spent 4 years in the lab. A little bit of a funny story about how I pulled that off. Just working on various neuropharmacology, nanotechnology areas, experimenting, doing pretty like dumb experiments, but just like learning how to think about science. And I would say that like nothing I learned in my undergrad necessarily directly went into Loyal. I mean, of course, my basic biological and chemistry understanding has been important. The frameworks are that important, but I think what was much more important was the frameworks that I built for understanding complex scientific areas, right? And how to read a paper where I don't understand anything and quickly parse through it, understand if something was a good experimental design or bad experimental design. Basically focusing on the frameworks instead of the explicit knowledge was probably the most helpful thing that I got out of undergrad.
Awesome. And then one thing I noticed sort of that you wrote on your website is that you had a bunch of meta goals. And I was really curious, like how much progress have you made towards those specific meta goals?
Yeah. I mean, which meta goals?
You talked about, quote unquote, making biotech sexy, for example, or, making, aging, I think you said making aging boring, things like that. So I'm so curious, how much progress have you made?
I think there's a long way to go. That's going to be like, for me, like maybe like making biotech sexy again, or like whatever you want to call that phrase. The basic idea is just like how a ton of people want to build space moonshots or whatever you want to call them. I really want people to be, or I would hope that people will be as enthusiastic and excited about building in bio too. It's actually, in my opinion, the same kind of category of founder. If you can build a rocket company, you can probably build a bio company if you build the right team around you. But there's just kind of been this, people will look at a biological problem and be kind of confused and not know how to think about it, not know how to think about the field. I think in part because the field is super open and very kind of convoluted to understand and not really like obvious endpoint milestones. It's like, oh, you have a graph and like in the treated, like the graph is like a little bit farther down, and in the placebo, it's a little like, it's not like a sexy, like, oh, hey, this rocket took off and it didn't. So it's like, how can we, make biological endpoints, treating diseases, developing new medicine as kind of exciting from a broad population. And that was actually one of the core theses of Loyal, like really the vision that I have one day, if we end up building efficacious drugs, if we execute excellently, if we basically like do the thing, I want to be on a stage one day with a dog that's, some chronological age, it's quite old, but is physiologically looks quite young and healthy. Like I think something like that would be really shocking, would be that like kind of visual validation that might hopefully kind of incite other people to be interested in it. And the other half of it, I think is also important, is just being, most biotech CEOs are like, no offense if you're a biotech CEO or this type of person in the audience, but like, mid 40s, mid 50s, mid 60s, like white dude, gray hair, has probably run, as a CEO for hire, has probably run 5 companies before this. It's quite rare to find like mid 20s female person like running a biotech company. And at least that hopefully kind of helps like make it a bit more accessible, right? Like I, look more like the people who are starting to figure out their careers right now and figure out what they want to spend time on, versus it can seem very inaccessible if the only kind of North Star and the only role models you can have for a role that you want to have are people who are decades older than you and have way more money than you and just like don't look like you.
Of course. Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm curious, before we get into, I guess, like more longevity specific questions, what's your why for studying longevity?
My why?
Yeah.
I have a lot of whys. I think the biggest one for me, the reason I got interested, so the reason I switched from studio art to neuroscience, and the reason why I was so compelled to do that, despite the fact that I love art, was that I went and worked in a neuro-oncology clinic the summer before I was going to start undergrad. And kind of the long story short is I met a number of terminal brain cancer patients. And there's just something about the idea, and I never really understood until then, that there's a huge category of diseases, probably like, I don't have data to back this, but I would say maybe like majority of severe ones, where if something happens to you, you can't really actually affect change. You can't actually affect the course of the disease significantly. You're still going to go to that endpoint, which is premature death. And it doesn't matter how hard you try. It doesn't matter how much effort you put in. It doesn't matter how good of a person you are. It doesn't matter how much you care, right? You can't do anything for that person. So like specifically like the glioblastoma, which is one of the most severe forms of brain cancer, patients who were there was nothing I could have done for them and nothing anybody in the world could have done for them. And it's something about that idea that you just like have no free will facing this foe, especially a foe that doesn't have any like general intelligence. It's just like a bunch of misbehaving cells, to simplify it. That really bothered me. And so that was how I got really Sorry, technical difficulty. You might want to mute Jared. Okay.
There we go. Awesome.
Jared,
I think there's
Okay. Nope. You got muted again.
Jared, there we go. I'll call on you, Jared. I'll call on you, and then you can speak.
Yeah, sorry. He just told me that there was a power cut in South Africa right now, so the microphone doesn't seem to be working. So I think we'll just go ahead with you, Rahul. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. I don't remember what I was saying. That scared me. Basically realized no free will. And then that's how I got interested in like complex age-related diseases. I was actually very interested in Parkinson's initially, which is a form of a neural disorder where you lose a very specific neuronal subtype, causes movement disorders. And then at that stage, it's like, wait, why are we looking at the disease when already you've lost a significant portion of critical brain mass, right? So like the problem of putting, like I was specifically very interested in like stem cell, whatever, at the time I was working in a lab that was like trying to replace the dopaminergic neurons that are lost. And it's just like, that's such a hard problem, right? To like put these cells back in, for them to root in, for them to, not become malignant, for them to, most importantly, like synapse correctly. Like it's obviously not an impossible problem, but many orders of magnitude, in my opinion, more challenging than potentially affecting the decades earlier processes, the aging processes that led potentially to that person developing that neurodegenerative disorder. So basically, I just got frustrated by acute treatments for complex diseases. I wanted to understand preventative treatments for acute diseases. And that's how I learned about the aging thesis. And I thought the aging thesis was crazy, actually, for a really long time, because of all the like psycho stuff that people say. But once I understood the science better, I realized the science actually made a lot of sense. And I decided that was where I wanted to focus my career. And I've just been very singularly focused on translational aging since then, which I guess is a nice thing, actually.
That's amazing. What's the sort of, like the hardest part of longevity that people sort of, kind of get wrong?
The thing that people get wrong about aging?
Yeah.
I mean, so I think there's a couple of things we get. So I always emphasize health span and lifespan. So health span being quality of life, lifespan being years of life. Realistically, on average, an aging drug is generally not going to extend lifespan without also extending health span, and you extend lifespan by extending health span. So it's kind of redundant. But we've started saying that because the first thing people think is how modern medicine works, right? for many age-related diseases where you like take a chemotherapeutic and yeah, you are extending lifespan or something, but you're not extending health span. The person is miserable. They're just basically delaying the inevitable. That's a really big one. I think also, and this is the thing that I ranted about on that blog post a week or so ago, I think a lot of people think that it's about like radical lifespan extension, about, you know, whatever. It's actually, in my opinion, a lot of what we're working on today is not necessarily a path to radical lifespan extension. It's, I think, a misconception that it's a linear thing, right? So that whatever gets us to, let's say, average lifespan of 100 and being healthier for a significant portion of that. So let's say maybe like people who are 80 on average are healthier, like 20% healthier than they are now. Whatever mechanism or mechanisms get us to that, I do not think necessarily are going to be in line with the mechanisms that get us to an average lifespan if we ever hit it of 150. That's going to be, that needs like a rate order difference, a rate order change in whatever we're doing biologically. Of course, we don't know. Nobody's done this before. It's a hypothesis, but I think it's not inevitable that it's linear. And I think a lot of people assume that it's linear.
Of course, yeah. You mentioned that there's, you know, quote unquote psychos, or, you know, people that sort of have this, you know, this like, I guess, like cult like following for aging, and I see it in crypto, I see it in space and other things. Like, do you think sort of this, I guess, the different motivations that some people have, like, you know, is it beneficial to the industry or is it negative?
Yeah, so in my opinion, so in crypto it was like positive on average, right? At least the people I've talked to who know a lot more about that field, and full disclosure, I know nothing about crypto. I just live in San Francisco, so it's just bashed into my head every so often. But on average, it seems like it was a positive to have these like really compelled people into it. I think there's a couple of reasons why that doesn't parallel over to pharma and to drugs. And I think part of it is that, like, by definition, crypto goes around on average the institutions. It doesn't need the institutions. It doesn't need the existing frameworks. It doesn't need the existing infrastructure on average to do the thing that it's intended to do. You can maybe make an aging drug in your garage, maybe, but it's not going to be broadly adopted, and it's not going to impact societal health, and it's not going to have the resources it needs on average to be able to do the thing, right? And so that's to say that I think there's actually a level of strategic conservatism is one of the core ideas at Loyal. I'm super ambitious. Like, we're building the first aging drugs, right? Like, I want to build like Moderna of aging, SpaceX of aging, like whatever you call it. But we pick our battles. And, you know, I think sometimes people just get so like, well, first we have to kill the FDA, then we can have it. And it's like, no. Like, let's be smart. Like, killing the FDA, like, it would take 20, 30 years, which we don't want to wait. So why don't we work within the existing framework and also not assume that, like, these are smart people, they're not evil. It's just like there's frameworks and you just have to work with them, right? Of course. And I think that's an important thing that the field, I think, has like cut itself at the ankles over and over and over again, because it's like very stubborn instead of just kind of figure out how to work within the constraints that happened and prove why we should change the constraints, right? Earn the right to change them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Similarly, I know another thing that you wrote about is that it's interesting how, like, you know, longevity drugs, how it'll sort of, you know, interact with like our broken healthcare system. So I'm curious, you know, like, will only, you know, wealthy people have access to them, or how can we avoid any sort of inequalities that come when, you know, hopefully these drugs do come to market?
So in my opinion, it obviously depends a lot on what the final modalities, the type of product these drugs are. If it's, you know, I don't think special modalities like, you know, super expensive gene therapies or whatever are going to be viable for aging for a while, because safety is like absolutely paramount, right? Like, that's one of the other things we're strategically conservative about. Is like, safety is never a variable in anything we develop. You know, we might not be a net positive, like our drug might not work, but we're not going to have a negative effect on the dog. And it's very, very, very important when you're trying to negotiate, trying to do something ambitious. And these kind of complex modalities, and the reason I bring up complex modalities is because their complex modalities are expensive, right? They're expensive to manufacture. They're expensive to develop. They're more complex. They're like, there's not, you know, there's huge industries for small molecule drugs. There's not huge industries yet for like gene therapy manufacturing, for example. So that's all to say. I think the first aging drugs are actually going to be quite simple. The way I'm thinking about them is simple, cheap, small molecules, similar to what we see with like statins, NSAIDs, et cetera, that are broadly adopted. And I think actually if we could have a multi-cause, pan-cause, all-cause, you know, whatever you want to call it, aging therapeutic that broadly affects various age-related diseases at once, that's actually a societal equalizer. Because I think what a lot of people don't realize is today, people can't afford the care for their diseases, at least in the States, right? You know, if you get a rare form of cancer, there are like $500,000 therapies out there, and you're probably not going to get them unless you're on a damn good insurance or have a good lawyer or have a lot of money, right? And so there's already this like baseline inequality there, plus like the hospital system that you can access and how often you can go, how much preventative care. Something that's a cheap at-home preventative therapeutic, of course, is not going to like prevent and cure cancer in the populace, but it can dampen the onset, dampen the severity by a significant, you know, even like 1 or 2%, like something that's like notable on a societal level. That'll broadly impact everybody, but it'll also most help the people who otherwise can't afford equal access to preventative and treative care. But I mean, the whole healthcare system is just like so messed up. Like, am I allowed to cuss? I don't know. I'm probably shouldn't cuss. It's messed up. You know what I'm trying to say? It's not aging drugs' fault, and I think it gets conflated into this whole thing when really we shouldn't think about not creating medicines. We also have a bad healthcare system.
Right, of course. Awesome, yeah. And I guess like similar to that, what do you think sort of, so if you think about like the entire, I guess, like scientific ecosystem, right? You know, startups and academia and government and everything in between, you know, what role does each of those sort of, you know, nodes play in longevity, or ideally, in your opinion? So, you know, what should government be doing, academia be doing, startups be doing, et cetera?
I mean, that's a big question. On average, and ideally, startups so government should fund early work that is not necessarily fruitful or not obviously fruitful, maybe doesn't have, you know, it's a basic science thing that doesn't have an obvious translational endpoint, right? Then startups exist to take the fruit out of academia, takes this money and, you know, researches it and figures out if there is anything interesting. It takes time, right? There's no like time variable in a lot of the work that academia does. And then startups are in their most ideal form, an accelerator, quote unquote, for a biological hypothesis, a drug, a mechanism to be translationally validated or not validated and bring it to the clinic. And then the next one that I believe you didn't mention, but is also relevant, is on average in biotech, pharma exists to take the thing that is validated in a startup for, you know, maybe a startup will have like 100 million, 200 million tops to do the thing. You have like phase 2 efficacy, so have like early preliminary efficacy of their drug and safety. Pharma exists to validate that efficacy, so final like pivotal phase 3 study, which can be very, very expensive, but also very challenging operationally to run. And then also bring it to market, which depending on the healthcare system you're in, and on average is very, very challenging to scale manufacturing, scale sales, push it through, you know, the complex weave of PBMs, insurance payers, all of that, hospital systems, and bring it over the finish line. It also can take these big swings that a small startup. This is actually one of the reasons I think biotech has been a little bit held back in a startup ecosystem, is because on average, a biotech startup is not building to build a sustainable organization, no matter what they say. They are building for an exit, and they are building public markets and then acquisition, or they're building an exit to pharma acquisition. That was one of the other reasons I did dogs, is because I don't want to work for anybody. I am the most antagonistic founder ever, and I am not trying to sell. And in dogs, it is cheap enough to bring a drug from idea to market approval without having to sell my soul, which sounded great to me.
That's always good, yeah. Awesome. So I guess it's, you know, it's similar to that also when it comes to, you know, like longevity companies. How do you sort of cut through all like the noise of all the, you know, sort of longevity as a whole, and sort of, you know, what mental models do you use to see like, you know, if a longevity company has potential or if it doesn't really?
Yeah. So see how like their depth of understanding is super important. I think there's a lot of people who like repeat these like tried phrases, like aging is a disease, and you know, only FDA would let us take rapamycin, or you know, metformin does X. Right? If they're just repeating tired tropes, on average, I have not found somebody who repeats those tired tropes and also actually understanding of the field. And it's okay if you don't, but you should just like acknowledge that. Like, I don't have an in-depth understanding of literally anything but aging, right? So like, no, like it's a complex field. Like it's totally chill. Make sure you like are cognizant that you don't have an in-depth understanding. Crypto. Another really common one is they're very dogmatic about some sort of like, oh, like sirtuins are the, you know, the where mTOR or this or that pathway. There's no one pathway towards aging. It is a very, very complex biological problem. And I think often when people will convince themselves or wrap themselves around a certain hypothesis, it shows a lack of, again, understanding of the field, but also just like a they're selling an idea instead of exploring a hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. That's pretty cool. And I think it's, and one thing you just mentioned before sort of reminded me of another question. So on your website, under your thoughts tab, you wrote about how you became bearish on sort of academic scientific founders and more interested in sort of non-scientific founders. So I'm curious, what sort of caused that sort of realization?
Yeah, I mean, so I want to asterisk because everything I'm saying is on average, and there are there's outliers in any direction. But yeah, so this is actually, it's funny. I was talking with somebody about this the other day. I've actually had this conversation like 5 times in the last.
Really?
Well, because everybody goes on this thesis. It's very like holistically aesthetic. And to be clear, like we had this thesis at Longevity Fund. Oh, Jared, hey.
Hey, Jared.
Hey, can you hear me? Please tell me this worked.
It's working beautifully.
I'm so sorry, everyone. It's been a 20-minute nightmare. But I'm here. Rahul, you've been doing a great job without me, so well done.
Well, I'm excited to share the spotlight. Rahul's been lobbing them. Really not wait here.
I mean, speaking of spotlights, like I had a power cut, so I just hung a torch above my head. Sorry, you were on a line of questioning. I'm just glad I'm here now.
So Rahul just asked me my thoughts on academic founders, and I'm curious if you have a contrary opinion to what I'm about to say. Basically, we were working on this at Longevity Fund. There's a lot of people who are working this now. I think there are obviously going to be amazing founders that come out of scientific labs, but I think the idea that you need to have discovered what you're like, I didn't discover anything regards to loyal. I mean, I had the hypothesis, right? But I didn't like discover it in a lab. My PhD was in health economics. The idea that like whatever you're working on is like also going to be a viable company, and you're going to have that insight, at 21 or 22 is just like a low probability. But also I think more importantly, there's a framework that you need to have as a founder that I find that academia anti-trains you on really strongly. So I got the kind of anti-training on this when I went and worked for Laura. My first year working for Laura was terrible because I came from Oxford, which is like the most conservative, hierarchical, slow, like everything organization, right? And formal. And I would like be in San Francisco and write like, "Dear Sir," like long, verbose emails. But it was not just that I was verbose in my emails. Like I just like didn't think in the way that Silicon Valley and therefore like startups in general think. And that untraining of indexing for speed, of MVPing things, of understanding what are rules because they're actually rules, and they're just like societal control mechanisms. The fact that like on average, like, this like blows the mind of people when I hire them. Like, look, you're like, I hired you because of what's in your brain. I didn't hire you because you have like 2 letters or 3 letters or whatever behind your name. Like, I actually don't give a shit if you have those letters. I care about like what's in your brain. But like, and it's just like a way of like on average showing that like you have that competency, and that like, if it's for an MD, it's obviously much more important. But like with PhDs, it's like a thing that's very hard, I think, for them to get. So this is all to say that like, I think that is the variable that I found on average, like these like scientific founders really, really struggle with. And I've not seen a group yet, and there might be one that I just don't know about, that's really done a good job of like incubating academics and scientists with that mindset super quickly. And I think if you are a scientist listening to this and who wants to get incubated with that, the way I did is just move to San Francisco. You'll get your butt 100 times over, and you'll learn it really, really quickly because everybody's around you. And then you can take all the good things you learned from being a scientist and scientific training to startups, right? But it's like it's a very different mental model of the world that is required. And that's why on average I'm bearish, because often they don't get that training, and then they just like move super, super slowly, and don't think it through as much, or don't understand how to like hack the world in their favor.
Of course. Yeah. Awesome. Jared, I'll let you go if you have any questions.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I agree with what Celine is saying. Academia has its own sort of set of incentives, and you get a lot of papers which often don't say or do much. And then, that mindset is kind of why I think San Fran is like such a hub for this, right? But Celine, I'm kind of curious what you think about, so it's one thing taking scientists and teaching them to become, founders. What about technical people who are not necessarily scientists, but they have technical expertise? I mean, I know more people who are computer scientists who are interested in longevity than I know like biology PhDs. So like, how do we 10x the number of bio founders? Maybe you have an opinion here, who aren't necessarily bio PhDs, but they have some technical skills to add. What I'll say, just to like give a flavor for how I'm thinking about this, is like the machine learning community is great at this, right? Like no one in machine learning really cares if you have a PhD. I mean, it's great if you do, But like DeepMind or OpenAI, like they will take you if you can just show that you are great at running reinforcement learning algorithms. And in biology, we're more conservative and we move slower and we respect credentials more, I think. And I wonder, if there's a way we can get around that and have that next generation of founder-led biotech, as we've been talking about.
Yeah, so this is an idea I'm super interested in, and I don't know what the solution is, but I really, I totally agree. I think if you want to unrate limit the amount of bio companies that are being started, you need to have basically like just how anybody can wake up and be like, I want to start a B2B SaaS company or whatever it is. Like, how do we do that also for bio? Obviously, it's always going to be harder, right? It's all like bio is super damn technical. Space is technical. Like these things are all hard. It's on average, fewer people are going to want to or be able to start a company in these areas, but it could undoubtedly be more. And I agree with you that like on average, people who are technical in something are going to have the correct frameworks to at least understand if somebody else who's biologically technical has thought through the problem, right? Because that's all it is. Like as a CEO, like I don't run the science at Loyal. Like I obviously understand it, but my VP of aging biology runs it. And then we have somebody who runs CMC. We have somebody who runs regulation. These are people who are all way more experienced than I am. I'm kind of like the router and the money accumulator and the like group kumbaya, and realistically as a CEO, it's actually what you should be. The CEO is also running the science. Like, probably something has gone terribly wrong. And you don't need to have a deep technical background. You don't need to be at a PhD for 10 years, in my opinion, to do what I do. And actually, I think one of our advantages has been like, I have no ego around not being deeply scientifically technical. And so I'm able to build an environment where people who are deeply technical can work and do their best work and not be, having issues battling with the CEO over some like esoteric thing because they're convinced they understand the science better. So I don't know. Nobody's done it really well yet, as far as I know. I think like YC could do it if they wanted to. I think there's a few other groups that could do it if they wanted to.
I mean, do you have any ideas you are like in the space right now. What skills would you say, like someone who's got a master's or a bachelor's in CS, what would they need to learn to be a good technical founder in the space?
Well, I don't think they could be. So what do you mean by technical? Like they couldn't be a scientific technical founder. I think they
they wouldn't be. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so not necessarily doing the science, right? But they would need to have an idea of what's going on, and they would need to build a team around them that could, actually do the science.
Yeah, so the advice that I usually give is dive deep into some area of biology deeply. It doesn't really matter what it is. It's really, orthogonal to the areas you're interested in. But I think it's more about building some of the frameworks, just like how we were talking earlier. My neuro undergrad, nothing I really learned there is relevant to Loyal, but the frameworks and like the skill sets that I built there were. So I think doing that once to extreme depth is super helpful. And then just talking to people who do understand that. Like one of the things, it's really hard to like verbalize, but I think the most important thing I learned in San Francisco when I first moved here is that if you're good at asking questions and if you're good at building frameworks, you can understand and kind of boil down any field you want in a short period of time. Of course, you're not going to be good enough to like run a company in it yet, but you can like understand the base problems and the constraints and how people are thinking about it and why is this constraint exist, and is it like an actual constraint or a hypothetical constraint or a constraint that's very technologically difficult or more societal difficult, and like building that skill set of being able to like boil down to like ground truth very quickly is a huge one. You should probably read Bio of the Cell. Like if you're going to run a bio company, you're going to have to know all the words. So that is really Biology of the Cell is like the canonical textbook, and just get to know people in the area. But yeah, I agree. It's difficult. Like, I think the biggest hard issue right now is how do you just like I couldn't find a good idea in like ML or whatever to start a company. I think it's very difficult for people coming in to figure out what's actually like valid to work on. I think the only way you can answer that, unfortunately, is just talking to a lot of people and understanding an area of the field well. You have to build a model of the industry, basically.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So I also have a few questions, I guess, more geared towards Loyal itself. So when it comes to, obviously the core sort of animal I play is dogs. And so I'm curious, why are dogs like great model organisms for longevity? And, have you thought of, looking to other organisms, such as, sharks or jellyfish or?
I'm happy to answer this, but should we do some for Jared since he just struggled so long to get on?
Oh yeah.
No, it's fine. Let's go with you, Celine. I mean, I'm genuine. Okay. So that's well. I want to know who's loyal for jellyfish coming.
Loyal for jellyfish. Well, we'll have it soon. Okay, I'll answer quickly so you can also have some room to add some wisdom. Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons I was interested in dogs. From a biological standpoint, they are a very good model, potentially one of the best models of human aging. They develop approximately the same age-related diseases we do at approximately the same point in their lives. The big exception being cardiac disease, because cardiac disease has a lot of environmental factors like diet, which are not relevant to. And they've also shared an environmental area with us for thousands of years. And environmental factors and kind of bred in environmental factors are actually a huge proponent of aging and a huge composition of aging. They've also co-evolved with us, so things like diet have been shared for a long time. And most importantly, like one of the challenges was like kind of modeling aging in model organisms. So things like, I have a tattoo of model organisms on my arm, actually. So like C. elegans, mice, and Labradors. Yeah, I'm going to put a human down here if we ever build a human aging drug. But one of the challenges of these organisms is they don't. So the idea of the aging field is they're developing drugs and some mechanisms by which we age over time to then affect the potential age-related diseases that somebody would have gotten, like the canonical diseases, right? So things like cancers, neurodegenerative disorders, dementia, whatever. But you need an animal that has that same process over time to assess if the drug is affecting that process, right? That's actually very complex. So dogs, since they live a longer time, again, because they develop these complex diseases, because they're inbred in ways that I'll talk about in a second, but they're not so inbred like a mouse is, where it's like been staying in a sterile environment for God knows how many generations. They emulate that process better, and therefore you're better able to tell if the drug is affecting that change or not. The second reason I went with dogs is because they have a market. There is a venture scale market to be built in aging drugs for dogs, which is not true for probably any other animal in play. Maybe cats, maybe. But cats live a really long time, so it's kind of difficult to tell if your drugs work. But that was really important, right? Because this like loyal needs to be a vibrant multi-billion-dollar business on its own if I'm going to be able to raise the money necessary to do all of the work that I'm doing. It's not just a research organization, it's a commercialization organization. And it's also important because one of the ideas that by developing the first aging drugs for dogs is a way to socialize aging thesis with people. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is that you have this lifespan disparity in dogs that you don't see in other species. So like a Great Dane on average will live 7 to 8 years, while a Chihuahua will live 16 to 18. There's a 2x differential, and it actually is very strongly negatively correlated with size. So the bigger a dog is, the shorter on average that breed's lifespan is. That is super weird. You don't see 2x lifespan differentials within the same species. Yeah. It's a consequence of inbreeding. Basically, we bred for these phenotypes. And it creates a nice model, again, of the hypothesis that these bigger dogs have an accelerated aging phenotype over smaller dogs. And therefore, it allows us to assay whether our drugs are working quicker than, a human, but also within a venture time scale, which again is very important, right? So again, it's like that strategic conservatism. I'm not trying to convince somebody to invest in a company that won't have results for 20 years. I've found a way to show results sooner so that they still have to leap to invest in a dog longevity company. Perhaps the leap is like a little bit smaller for that reason.
Interesting, yeah.
I also really like animals and dogs, as we were talking about earlier.
Of course.
That is not why I started a dog company.
I got you. Jared, how about you? Like, if you were to study any sort of organism that has some sort of longevity kind of ability, what would it be and why?
I mean, I think I kind of take my inspiration here. Alex Chen has spoken a lot about the fact that, and there's other people who've said this, but the non-model organisms, the ones that aren't on Celine's arm yet, they have like just a really interesting genomes and regulatory networks. And so people are doing work on this, but like we could easily know or like publish 10 times as many papers on like naked mole rats and the bowhead whale and even organisms which don't prototypically live long, but like I think people have spoken before about parrots, have a really interesting sort of metabolome, and they have to, relative for their size and the metabolic rate, they live quite long, right? Yeah. And like that data, we just don't tend to get it because, as Celine pointed out, like mice are just much easier to work with. They are common. And also, I've had this discussion before, and we were just talking about the problem with academia. One of them is that when you publish, you have to compare your result with someone else's usually, right? And to get comparisons, you have to work with whatever they happen to use before you. This is the problem with like cell lines, the problem with culture media, this is the problem with the model organisms, because like non-hypothesis driven sort of just exploratory research doesn't necessarily get awarded grants, and it doesn't get awarded good papers or published in high places, and that doesn't advance your career. And so no one was really keen to do that, even though, there could be something crazy lurking in the genomes of these animals,
Yeah. And one thing I'll say here, this is actually a phenomena that even more severe in aging because of how long it takes to run a complex interventional lifespan and health span study and how expensive it is. If you actually want to like agnostically look at health span phenotypes. And this is one of the reasons I wish I had this, Michael, our VP of aging, made this like beautiful table showing that like there's a ton of drugs that have shown lifespan extension. Very few have ever been replicated. And the ones that have been replicated are the ones that you hear about all the time, right? So there's like this false bias because it's not that many people have like run complex, well-run lifespan studies that because we have a couple things that have been replicated, everyone becomes obsessed with these mechanisms and these pathways and these drugs. When realistically, they're just the ones that like somebody had a few $100,000 and like threw it. And like that's a bit downplaying the biological importance of some of these mechanisms, but it is a huge, an especially huge bias, and a really good point by Jared. The kind of false dichotomies that the complexity of academia can sometimes put on how a field is understood.
Mm-hmm, of course. And it's funny you guys mentioned nonmodel organisms. I don't know if you guys know, but I'm working at Arcadia Sciences, newly founded research lab for nonmodel organisms, and so definitely agree with you guys there, and that's awesome. So
if you don't mind, maybe say a little bit more about that. I mean, this, I think if we turn this slightly into a panel discussion, I'd love to hear that. And I'm sure everyone in the audience who doesn't know about Arcadia would, first of all, I'll plug Arcadia. It's an awesome idea and exactly the kind of data we need on these non-model organisms. So you should say more there.
Yeah, of course. So, sort of like the overarching thesis of Arcadia is that like, we've been sort of studying mice and maybe, worms and fruit flies and everything for decades on end. And every single other animal out there is sort of like, this like gold mine of, maybe, applications for human health or any other things that we could sort of, study. And so we want to create like an organization, research organization, but also like a more sort of, startup centered kind of one where, we're not really in the game to write papers, but actually just spin out startups. So it's really, really cool. That's where I come in. I don't have any bio background, but I'm helping them sort of incubate the startups and stuff. And so that's what sort of Arcadia is doing. And we're already working on some, on two really cool kind of companies, again, all around non-model organisms and sort of, applying their, superpowers to humans and stuff. And so, we'll see what happens. It is an experiment in and of itself, but it's what I'm pretty excited for. So, yeah.
Yeah. And one thing I'll emphasize there. So Fauna Bio, I believe, has either been funded or is like involved with Arcadia now. And Fauna is one of my favorite companies that Longevity Fund were funded. And what they're basically trying to look at is the different mammals that hibernate and understanding basically why can a mammal hibernate, basically curl up into a ball and sleep for, however many months and not have muscle atrophy, not have cardiac atrophy, have a slower metabolism. And can you look at this to basically reverse it and look at sarcopenia drugs, also like hypersleep for going to Mars. If somebody has to recover for a period of time, bed wasting is actually a very severe issue for people who have been in the hospital for a long time. Super cool company by 3 women. I love them. So, strong pitch for Fauna Bio, and they're totally going to discover something cool if they haven't already.
Yeah, and yeah, you are right. Arcadia, I think, invested in the recent round, so definitely do like that. Fun. They're doing some really cool stuff. Yeah. Speaking of startups and stuff, I'm really curious, Celine. What sort of management lessons did you learn like the hard way? And do you have any like particular like your war stories that you can share?
I have to think on the like war stories. I think there's a lot of So a couple of frameworks that I've learned that I can't say I'm perfect about, but I've at least gotten better. One is like literally never assume anything. Like every time I've ever assumed anything, when I thought I had all the data, when I thought I knew what was happening in the situation, I was always wrong, always making myself an idiot. Always had to go and apologize to my team afterwards. So just literally never assume. Like have all the data, ask the questions, come from a point of being agnostic. And that's how you kind of figure it out. 2 is just like an emotional, just like straight line. I think something that startups do to you that is both a positive and a negative is they kind of dampen your emotional range. So I don't really like react to good news that much anymore. Like I actually more like downplay significant milestones at Loyal, both to the team and to the investors. And they're a really big deal, but I'm just like, well, of course we did it. Like we did it. And everyone's like, no, that's a big deal. And I'm like, yes. I also don't react to the negatives, right? And I don't get stressed out. I just am, right? It's kind of like I'm a organism that exists now. And that's great for me, right? Because if you're like, woo, like that, it can be very stressful for your team. And I think just the third one I would say is just kind of being facilitatory of others. This has actually been like everything breaks. And I always want to like take things and like take them from my team, not because I'm like trying to be controlling, but because I'm like, oh God, I'm sorry. I like asked you to deal with this really annoying thing. Like rippling broke for the 100th time. Like, I'm sorry. Like I'll do it. And then I don't do it because I don't have enough time because I do that to everybody. And it's actually more annoying for the team. So I really kind of transitioning more to just like okay, how can I facilitate you and empower you to do this thing and like own this, and I'm not involved, right? Besides just like helping you. As far as war stories, I would have to think a little bit more. I think maybe the biggest one, or maybe like a funny story. So we like kicked off. I closed my round January 2020. It was just me. Immediately started hiring people, and then we found who would become our VP of Aging Biology, Michael LaCroix Freilich. We had this huge debate because Michael couldn't move from New York to San Francisco because nobody has kids wants to move to San Francisco. Like, I don't blame him. Yeah. And we had this huge thing like, oh, can we hire somebody remote? Like, I don't know if we can have an executive remote. I think this is too big of a stretch. And we made a decision to hire him. And actually the week I was supposed to go fly to New York to hire him is when the first kind of COVID cases started hitting in New York City. So, and then we went fully remote. So we have built the entire company remote for the first time. And it's actually been very funny because we get in person. I'm just like, wow, I've never stood in front of a crowd this big before because I haven't built that skill set literally at all because everything has been over Zoom. So really not a war story, but just a good example of like thinking through stuff from first principles and not being like biased by like, well, everybody is in the office all the time because that's how it was until, 2 years ago. Yeah. Sorry, it's kind of a lame war story, but all the ones I can think of involve people, so I probably shouldn't talk about them.
That makes sense. That's actually very interesting. I did not know that you built Loyal remotely for the most part, I guess, like for the last 2 years.
Yeah, no, so I signed an office lease March 2020. We were 3 people.
Brilliant.
I know it was a great executive decision on my end. The funny thing is, like, I'm bio. Like, if anybody could have like predicted what was about to happen, it should have been me. But I was just like, there's no way. Like, and I remember I pushed back my like office party by 3 weeks because when they shut down everything in San Francisco, it's like it'll be better in 3 weeks. Like, what? Why did I think that? Like, why did I think that this wouldn't be long? Like, the cognitive dissonance was real. But yes, we are hybrid now, which is great.
Awesome. Jared, do you have anything to say? I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, like something which one of Celine's blog posts, which I read a couple of months back, and I still remember it, was the one on like what the aging field needs. And I think that's just like a super interesting conversation to have. I mean, if you guys haven't already like covered that topic, because kind of like hearing your opinions, Celine, you're operating in the space. As you said, you're young, you are not the typical founder like in biotech, from like Boston, middle age, run a bunch of companies. And like hearing you say a bunch of things, and especially coupled with your thesis, which I'm sure Rahul has pushed you on, the idea of like aging biology and drugs should be boring, which I think you hinted at that in that original piece. You said like this shouldn't be about 1,000-year lifespans. But if you want to maybe like recap for people listening, like some of the things you think the aging field needs, I'd love to talk about that,
Yeah, I mean, I can read it off. You guys are quoting all my articles. I'm just like making sure I'm getting them like straight in my head. So this is actually a meta thing I'll say for anybody listening. Start writing. Writing has by far been the most valuable thing I've ever done for my career. If you go back into my early writings, they're literally just like one-woman journal clubs and like writing about like, peptide-mediated drug delivery, like things like nobody read them. I could like look at the stats on my website and tell you that nobody has read them. But it was so helpful for me to learn how to position something for a broader audience. And then now as I've gotten more, and I guess the other thing is like I didn't force myself or like have ego about not having insights. I had no insights, which is why I wrote about other papers. But then as I've done more interesting things, I've built up insights and I've become more cognizant of the insights because I write the entire time. It's also been like great for recruiting because people can like figure out how my brain thinks. You can't like fake, years of writing. You can fake being like a certain way in an interview for 30 minutes, right? So that's my pitch, start writing. But no, so the what the aging field needs was my quick blog post on basically like what I think the field needs to like move forward and get the first drug approved, which to me is like the North Star. So it was more teams taking on regulatory risk. So the idea that so when I was at Longevity Fund, a lot of companies would pitch us and they'd be like, oh, FDA is evil, aging isn't an indication. So we're going for like X or Y specific disease. I think there actually needs to be teams that are like smartly and intelligently taking on that question of like, how do you actually get an aging drug approved for aging? Right. And like who take on that risk. And that is a core risk that the investors are bought into. And that actually is one of the other reasons going back to not wanting to sell out or like have a model that would allow me that like was dependent on big pharma for an acquisition or for a return on investment for my investors is because I wanted to take on those risks. And I wouldn't be able to do that if I had to sell to big pharma. So that was one. The second one was like more translational aging companies. So again, not so many discovery companies. We have all these companies who are trying to discover new mechanisms, new ideas. Really interesting. They need to exist. But this translational problem is a huge bottleneck still. So if all these cool aging drugs get developed and then hit the wall and then have to like get approved for like random esoteric indications that in my opinion are not representative of aging themselves, we haven't achieved the goal. So we need both, right? Things aren't binary, but we definitely need more translational aging companies, more sustainable business models, so companies that aren't dependent on being bought by pharma, more investors bullish on aging. It is unbelievable how many people I have to like explain the aging thesis to and convince them that it's a venture scale market. I will call out Rahul here. Lux passed on Loyal because they didn't think the market was big enough.
They did. I didn't know that.
But it's true, right? Like it's like the thesis isn't been validated, and there isn't like a number that one can point to and be like, yeah, the aging thesis is like, oh, this will be $1 billion thing. So we need more investors to like believe in that hypothesis, because otherwise that's such a big thing that somebody has to believe in in addition, believe in many, many other things. And it just becomes too big of basically a package to convince somebody of. And then more strategic conservatism, we've talked about that. So not yelling about 1,000-year lifespans, more new ideas. Please, love of God, we do not need another like D2C metformin or rapamycin company, and an interdisciplinary approach. So I think the biggest thing here is like, I actually, on average, we don't hire people who have traditionally studied aging. We will if you're amazing, please still apply. But like on average, we actually have a mostly neuroscience team, because aging is actually represented in everything, and having people who have different biological point of views and then who apply that to the aging problem, we have found, think about the field in a way that isn't biased by the frameworks of the aging field. So that was a very quick overview of that. Let me know if you want me to dive into any of that.
I mean, maybe like feel free to take this direction you want, but if you want to talk about, when you say we need more new ideas, I totally agree with you. I mean, first of all, I think it's a debate unto itself. Is there a single small molecule that can target aging? I don't think that's true. I think we have like good reasons to believe that, especially messing with nutrient sensing pathways, is not going to be the holy grail. So in terms of new ideas, if you were, starting out again, and for some reason someone else was building the awesome dog company, what would you kind of be looking at, and whose Google Scholar alerts would you be signing up for?
That's a good question. I think my advantage is, so I would never start like a small molecule discovery company or antibody discovery company. I think I could like do a fine job. I don't think I'm like the world's best CEO for that company. And this is maybe another helpful framework, is figuring out what like intersections of competence that you have that make you the best person to run on a specific thing. And for me, those intersections brought me to Loyal. So it's a little bit of a dodging question, because I don't actually I think if Loyal died tomorrow, I would just be like, you just like find me sitting on the streets of San Francisco, like lost, wandering about, like ranting about dogs and metabolic fitness and all of these things. I probably wouldn't know what to do with myself. Occupational hazard of starting a startup. I think honestly what Arcadia and Rahul are working on with the model organisms is a huge one. But I think actually I wouldn't do a startup. I would probably work more directly on the regulatory aspects if I wasn't doing Loyal. So specifically, how do we think better? So there's a lot of, this is too much to get into right now, but there's a lot of ways in which animal health is regulated that I actually think is like very facilitatory. It's one of the reasons we can build an aging drug in animal health and not in human health. That might be a good POC, proof of concept, of that thesis in dogs, that regulatory thesis in dogs, to bring over to people. So I'd probably work on that problem. I don't think I'm the person who would ever run at this stage of my career and at this stage where we are, like a discovery company.
Right.
Because again, I'm like scientific, but I'm not like a scientific founder.
Unfortunately, the session is coming to an end. We should do another session at some point in the longer run. Thanks so much for coming. I think that was super insightful.